3 years ago, Emily Carter was paid to disappear from Alexander Whitmore's life. Today, she arrived to purchase the one thing he believed no one could ever take from him. The top floor of Whitmore Group was silent enough to hear the elevator doors open. 40 stories above Manhattan, inside a glass boardroom overlooking the East River, Alexander Whitmore sat at the head of a table carved from dark walnut, wearing the calm expression of a man who had inherited power so long ago he had forgotten it could be lost. Around him, 12 board members avoided eye contact with the quarterly report in front of them. The numbers were not just bad, they were catastrophic. 3 failed acquisitions, $2 billion in debt exposure, and a stock price that had dropped so fast in 6 weeks that every financial network in America had started using the same phrase, legacy collapse. Alexander hated that phrase. Legacy was not supposed to collapse. Legacy was supposed to be protected by names, bloodlines, private schools, old money, and the kind of reputation that made bankers smile before reading the fine print. For generations, Whitmore Group had been untouchable. Hotels in Boston, shipping contracts in Charleston, private equity holdings in Dallas, commercial towers in Chicago, and a headquarters in New York that looked less like an office and more like a monument. But monuments still needed cash flow. And this morning, Alexander needed a buyer. Not a partner. Not a consultant. A buyer. The chairman cleared his throat and said the representative from Cartervale Capital had arrived. Alexander adjusted his cufflinks and leaned back, expecting some gray-haired Wall Street predator with a polished smile and a knife hidden behind legal language. Cartervale had appeared out of nowhere 3 years ago, then became the most feared acquisition firm in the country. They bought distressed companies, cleaned out weak leadership, doubled revenue, and never apologized for taking control. Alexander had never met the CEO. Almost no one had. The name on the paperwork was always E. Carter. The boardroom doors opened. First came 2 attorneys, then a young analyst carrying a leather portfolio, then a woman in a white tailored suit walked in as if the building had been waiting for her. Alexander's face did not change at first. His mind refused to accept what his eyes had already understood. Emily Carter stopped at the opposite end of the table. She was not the quiet wife who used to stand behind him at charity dinners. She was not the woman his family had dismissed as ordinary, not the woman he had once handed a divorce agreement and a check like both were favors. Her hair was swept back, her posture was still, and her eyes held no anger, which somehow made the room feel colder. One board member whispered her name. Another dropped his pen. Alexander slowly stood, but no words came out. Emily placed a thick acquisition binder on the table, perfectly aligned it with 2 fingers, and looked directly at him. 3 years ago, you paid me to disappear, she said. Today, I'm here to buy everything you thought made you powerful. No one moved. Outside the windows, traffic crawled through Manhattan like nothing had changed. But inside that room, Alexander Whitmore finally understood that the woman he had discarded had not come back for an apology. She had come back with a price. The first time Emily Carter understood that Alexander Whitmore would never choose her, she was standing beneath a chandelier worth more than the apartment building where she had grown up. It was 3 years earlier, on a cold October evening in Manhattan, inside the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation Gala, where every marble column had been wrapped in white roses and every guest seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Emily did not. She had spent 4 hours preparing for that night, not because she loved attention, but because Alexander had told her the gala mattered. It was the foundation's largest annual event, a gathering of donors, investors, senators, old family friends, and journalists who treated the Whitmore name like it was carved into American history. As his wife, Emily believed she would stand beside him. She believed that, for one night, he would introduce her with respect instead of tolerance. She believed that if she smiled, kept her voice calm, and followed every rule his family had placed around her, maybe the room would finally stop looking at her like a mistake. But when she arrived, the seating chart told the truth before anyone had the courage to say it. Alexander Whitmore was listed at Table 1, beside his mother, the chairman of Whitmore Group, 2 major investors, and Vanessa Blake. Emily Carter Whitmore was listed at Table 7, between a junior publicist and a retired donor who had already asked her twice whose assistant she was. At first, Emily thought it had to be an error. She stood near the gold-framed seating display with her gloved hand resting against the edge of the table, reading the names again and again, waiting for the letters to rearrange into something less humiliating. They did not. Behind her, two women laughed softly. One whispered that the Duke's wife had finally been placed where she belonged. The other said Vanessa looked more like a duchess than Emily ever had. Emily kept her face still. That was one of the first lessons she had learned after marrying Alexander. In rich rooms, pain was only acceptable if it was invisible. She turned just as Alexander entered the ballroom, and for one heartbeat, everything around her went quiet. He looked exactly the way the cameras loved him, tall, composed, dressed in a black tuxedo that made him seem untouchable. The room shifted toward him the way flowers turn toward sunlight. Then Vanessa Blake appeared beside him, her hand lightly resting on his arm. She wore champagne silk, diamonds at her ears, and the confident smile of a woman who had never needed permission to belong anywhere. The photographers moved instantly. Flash after flash lit up the ballroom as Alexander leaned closer to hear something Vanessa said. To the cameras, it looked intimate. To Emily, it looked practiced. A reporter from a business magazine stepped forward and asked Alexander about the future of Whitmore Group. Alexander gave his polished answer about stability, growth, and family legacy. Then the reporter turned to Vanessa and asked whether she would be involved in the foundation's new leadership council. Vanessa smiled and said she was honored to support Alexander's vision. Alexander did not correct her. He did not say his wife was standing 20 feet away. He did not look for Emily in the crowd. He simply nodded, as if Vanessa's place beside him made sense. Emily felt the room notice her noticing. That was the worst part. Not the slight itself, but the silent agreement around it. The donors knew. The board members knew. His mother knew. Everyone understood that Emily had the ring, but Vanessa had the position. When dinner began, Emily walked to table 7 without protest. Every step felt longer than the last. She passed table 1 and heard Vanessa laugh at something Alexander said. His mother, Margaret Whitmore, lifted her glass without looking at Emily. At table 7, the junior publicist tried to make conversation about the floral arrangements, but Emily could barely hear him over the sound of her own restraint. She had been trained by humiliation to become elegant under pressure. Smile. Sip water. Keep your shoulders back. Do not give them the satisfaction of a scene. Halfway through the first course, Margaret Whitmore appeared behind Emily's chair with a small cream envelope in her hand. She did not sit. She did not soften her voice. She simply placed the envelope beside Emily's plate and said, "Alexander wanted you to have this before the speeches begin." Emily looked down at it. Her name was written across the front in Alexander's handwriting. For one fragile second, she let herself hope it might be an apology. Perhaps he had noticed. Perhaps he had sent a note explaining that the seating arrangement had been his mother's doing, that he would fix it after dinner, that she mattered more than this room made her feel. Emily opened the envelope beneath the tablecloth, shielding it from curious eyes. Inside was not an apology. It was a folded legal document. A divorce agreement. Her breath stopped, but her face did not move. The first page was clipped to a cashier's check so large it felt insulting before she even read the number. The terms were clean, efficient, and cruel in the way expensive attorneys knew how to be. Confidential separation. No public statement without approval. No claim to Whitmore assets. No future use of the Whitmore name. Immediate relocation recommended. Emily stared at the line prepared for her signature. Around her, forks tapped against porcelain, champagne bubbled in crystal glasses, and the foundation orchestra began playing something soft and classical, as though her life had not just been reduced to paperwork between the salad course and the keynote speech. From across the ballroom, Alexander finally looked at her. Their eyes met. He did not appear nervous. He did not appear ashamed. If anything, he looked relieved that the message had been delivered without requiring him to leave his table. Vanessa leaned toward him and touched his sleeve again, and Emily understood the full design of the evening. This was not a mistake. This was not poor timing. This was a public removal disguised as a private decision. They had seated her away from him so the room could adjust before the announcement. They had let Vanessa stand beside him so the cameras could begin rewriting the story. They had handed Emily the divorce papers in a crowded ballroom because they believed she would be too embarrassed to react. And they were right about one thing. Emily did not react. She folded the agreement carefully, placed it back inside the envelope, and set it on her lap. Her hands were cold, but steady. When Alexander rose to give his speech, he thanked his mother, his board, his investors, and Vanessa Blake for her extraordinary commitment to the foundation's future. He did not mention his wife. The applause came like rain against glass. Emily sat through every second of it. She watched the man she had once tried to understand become a stranger in front of 500 people. She watched a room full of powerful Americans erase her without ever needing to raise their voices. And somewhere between Alexander's final sentence and the standing ovation, something inside her went silent. Not broken. Silent. That silence was different. It was not surrender. It was calculation. Because while Alexander believed he was ending an inconvenient marriage, Emily was remembering every password he had forgotten, every report his executives had ignored, every late night she had spent repairing financial models no one knew she had built, and every secret weakness hidden beneath the polished Whitmore name. By the time dessert was served, Emily Carter had stopped hoping to be chosen. She had started deciding what Alexander Whitmore would lose first. By midnight, the gala had become exactly what the Whitmore family wanted it to be, a beautiful public performance with no visible cracks. The donors had applauded. The photographers had captured Alexander beside Vanessa from every flattering angle, and the foundation had announced a new leadership council that made Emily's absence from the stage feel intentional, not accidental. She stayed until the final toast because leaving early would have given them a story to tell. She smiled when an elderly donor complimented the evening. She thanked the junior publicist who apologized under his breath for the seating chart, even though both of them knew he had not designed it. She let Margaret Whitmore pass by without earning a single visible reaction. Only when the last cluster of guests drifted toward the coat check did Emily retrieve the cream envelope from her clutch and walk toward the private elevator reserved for family. Alexander was already waiting inside. For the first time all night, Vanessa was not beside him. The elevator doors closed with a soft metallic sigh, sealing them away from the chandeliers, the applause, and the cameras that had made his betrayal look respectable. Alexander looked at Emily through the mirrored wall, not directly at first, as though eye contact required more courage than he had expected. "You handled yourself well," he said. Emily almost laughed, but she did not give him the satisfaction of hearing anything break in her voice. "Was that the purpose of tonight?" she asked. "To test whether I could be humiliated quietly?" His jaw tightened. "That is not fair." "No," Emily said, turning toward him at last. "Fair would have been a conversation before your mother placed divorce papers beside my dinner plate." The elevator descended past the private floors of the hotel, each number glowing above the doors like a countdown. Alexander slipped one hand into his pocket, the gesture casual enough to seem rehearsed. "The timing was unfortunate." "Unfortunate is a delayed flight," Emily said. "Unfortunate is rain on an outdoor wedding. What happened tonight was planned." He did not deny it. That told her more than any confession could have. When they reached the underground garage, a Blacktown car waited beside a polished concrete pillar. The driver opened the rear door, but Emily did not get in. She stood beneath the fluorescent lights in her ivory evening gown, the envelope still in her hand, and looked at the man she had once believed might learn to love her in his own careful, difficult way. "Tell me the truth," she said. "Did you choose this, or did your mother choose it for you?" Alexander looked away. For years, that had been his answer to every hard question. Silence dressed as dignity. "Emily, this marriage was never simple." "I did not ask if it was simple. I asked if you chose it." He exhaled slowly. "I agreed." The words landed colder than anger would have. Agreed. Not regretted. Not struggled with. Not fought against. Simply agreed. As if ending a marriage could be handled with the same detached approval he gave to quarterly budgets. The ride back to the Whitmore townhouse on the Upper East Side lasted 18 minutes. Emily knew because she watched every minute pass on the small digital clock above the privacy screen. Outside, Manhattan glittered in sharp lines of gold and white, but inside the car, the air felt sealed and formal. Alexander spoke about practical arrangements. A temporary residence could be provided. Her personal belongings would be packed discreetly. A statement would be drafted after a suitable delay. The check was meant to ensure comfort. She listened without interrupting, studying his voice as though it belonged to a stranger she needed to evaluate. He was not cruel in a loud way. That would have been easier to hate. Alexander Whitmore was cruel in the polished way of people who believe they were being reasonable while asking someone else to disappear. When they arrived, the townhouse staff had already been dismissed for the night. That, too, had been planned. The marble foyer was dim, lit only by two brass lamps near the staircase. Emily climbed the stairs without waiting for him, moving past portraits of Whitmore ancestors who had all been painted as though they had never doubted their right to own the room. Alexander followed her to the library, the one place in the house where she had spent more time than any wife was expected to spend. The library was 2 stories high, lined with dark shelves and old legal volumes no one opened. On the far wall stood a locked cabinet where Alexander kept company archives, board minutes, and outdated drives from years of corporate records. Emily had been the only person in that house who actually understood half of what was inside. Alexander closed the library doors behind them. "I know tonight was difficult," he began. Emily placed the envelope on his desk. "Do not soften it now." He paused. "Fine. The marriage is over. It has been over for a long time. For you," she said. "For both of us," he replied, too quickly. "You were never happy here. Because no one here wanted me to be." A flicker crossed his face, but it was gone before it became regret. "You knew what this family required. I knew what your family demanded. I kept waiting to learn what you required." He looked at the envelope, then back at her. "I am offering you a clean exit. Most people would consider the terms generous. Most people did not spend 2 years being treated like a clerical error in their own marriage." Alexander's expression hardened at that. Pride always returned to him when tenderness failed. "You are making this personal." Emily stared at him. "It is a divorce, Alexander. It is supposed to be personal." For a moment, the room went quiet except for the faint hum of the city beyond the tall windows. Then he opened the envelope, removed the agreement, and placed a fountain pen beside it. The gesture was so final that Emily felt something inside her lock into place. Not grief, not panic, a door closing. "Sign tonight," he said. "It will be easier for everyone." "For everyone," she repeated. "Or for Vanessa?" His eyes sharpened. "Vanessa has nothing to do with this." Emily lowered her gaze to the papers, scanning the clauses with the speed of someone who had learned to read contracts while men assumed she was reading menus. No claim to marital assets. No challenge to inherited holdings. No disclosure of private company matters. No future public statement referencing Whitmore Group without written approval. There it was, the clause that mattered most. They were not only trying to remove her from Alexander's life. They were trying to lock away everything she knew. Emily reached for the pen. Alexander relaxed too early. She signed her name cleanly on the final page, then turned to the cashier's check clipped beneath the agreement. The number printed across it was large enough to buy a penthouse, large enough to make a woman like Margaret Whitmore believe dignity had a market price. Emily lifted the check, looked at it once, and tore it neatly in half. Alexander stared at her. She placed the 2 pieces on the desk between them. "Keep it," she said. "One day, you will need cash more than I do." For the first time that night, he actually smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You think pride is a plan?" "No," Emily said. "I think preparation is." He leaned back slightly. "Preparation for what?" Emily did not answer. Instead, she turned toward the shelves behind him, toward the locked archive cabinet with the brass key, still resting in the small ceramic bowl where Alexander always left it because he trusted habit more than people. She had noticed that key on her first week in the townhouse. She had noticed the cabinet's contents during her 3rd month. And by the end of her first year as his wife, she had noticed something far more important. Whitmore Group was not nearly as stable as it pretended to be. Years before, during a liquidity crisis no one in the press had ever discovered, Emily had built a predictive risk model from public filings, shipping data, hospitality occupancy trends, loan schedules, and acquisition exposure across several states. She had done it quietly after overhearing Alexander argue with his chief financial officer in this very library. He had been too proud to explain the problem, so Emily solved it without being asked. She sent the model anonymously through an internal channel to a senior analyst she had once helped at a charity finance workshop. Within 3 months, Whitmore Group shifted its debt structure, exited 2 bad contracts, and avoided a collapse that would have cost them nearly $800 million. The board praised Alexander for strategic instinct. Margaret called it proof that Whitmore blood always knew when to move. No one knew the model had come from Emily. No one except the archived system logs stored inside that cabinet. Alexander believed he was divorcing a woman with no leverage. Emily knew she was leaving a house full of men who had mistaken silence for ignorance. "You should go upstairs and pack what you need," Alexander said. "I will have the rest sent wherever you decide to stay." Emily nodded as if accepting his instruction. "I will only take what is mine." "Of course." He said it like a courtesy. He did not realize it was a warning. Alexander left the library first, carrying the signed agreement and the torn check, probably eager to inform his mother that the unpleasant part was finished. Emily waited until his footsteps faded down the hall. Then she walked to the ceramic bowl, lifted the brass key, and opened the archive cabinet. Inside were folders, old meeting notes, external drives, backup access cards, and sealed envelopes labeled by fiscal year. She did not touch the jewelry box Alexander had once given her. She did not touch the cash drawer. She did not touch anything sentimental enough to be noticed immediately. She removed one slim external drive marked Legacy Risk Review, a drive no one had opened in years because no one there understood what legacy risk really meant. Beneath it was a printed audit trail showing the original upload, the anonymous model, and the internal rerouting that had allowed senior leadership to claim her work as executive strategy. Emily folded the audit trail and placed it inside her clutch. Then she returned the key to the bowl exactly as she had found it. Upstairs, she packed one suitcase, 2 pairs of shoes, 3 dresses, her passport, her mother's old gold locket, a notebook filled with formulas, investor names, and observations she had once been too afraid to use. When she reached the foyer, Alexander was not there. Margaret was. She stood near the staircase in a silk robe, her silver hair perfect even after midnight, her expression satisfied enough to be ugly without raising her voice. "You made the right decision," Margaret said. Emily paused with her hand on the suitcase handle. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. I made a quiet one." Margaret's smile thinned. "There is no need to be dramatic. Women like you recover quickly when properly compensated." Emily looked at her for a long second, then glanced toward the closed library doors. "You really believe money is the only thing people can take from this family? It is the only thing people ever wanted from us." Emily smiled then, not brightly, not kindly, but with the calm of someone who had finally seen the exact shape of her opponent's weakness. "That is why you never protected what mattered." Margaret did not understand. That made it better. Emily walked out of the townhouse alone. The October air was cold against her face, and for the first time all night, she breathed fully. Behind her stood the Whitmore home, bright and expensive and hollow. Ahead of her waited a city that did not care whose wife she used to be. She rolled her suitcase to the curb, opened a rideshare app, and entered a destination in Queens, where an old college friend had once told her she could sleep on the couch whenever pride became too expensive. As the car pulled away from the curb, Emily looked back only once. Not because she wanted Alexander to run after her. Not because she wanted the family to regret her before morning. She looked back to remember the building, the windows, the names on the brass mailbox, and the exact feeling of being dismissed by people who had no idea she already knew where their empire was weakest. By sunrise, the Whitmores would believe Emily Carter had vanished with one suitcase and a wounded heart. They would not know she carried the proof of her own erased brilliance in her clutch. They would not know that before the week ended, she would be on a flight out of New York with no settlement money, no husband, and no intention of ever asking permission again. And they would not know the most dangerous thing about the woman they had discarded. Emily had spent years learning how powerful people hide their fear, and now she knew exactly how to read it. Emily did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of a borrowed couch in a narrow apartment in Queens, still wearing the ivory gown that had made her look like a wife at the beginning of the evening and a ghost by the end of it. Outside the window, the elevated train passed every few minutes, shaking the glass with a rhythm that felt nothing like the polished silence of the Whitmore townhouse. Nora Sullivan had opened the door at 1 in the morning with sleepy eyes, taken one look at Emily's suitcase, and said nothing except, "Bathroom is down the hall. I have coffee." That was why Emily had come to her. Nora had never needed tragedy explained before offering shelter. For the first hour, Emily simply sat with a mug warming her hands while her mind replayed the night in fragments. The seating chart, Vanessa's hand on Alexander's arm, Margaret's envelope beside the salad plate. Alexander saying the timing was unfortunate. The torn check resting on his desk like a small white flag she had refused to wave. By 3 in the morning, the shock had worn off. By 4, grief tried to enter. By 5, Emily opened her laptop and made grief wait outside. The external drive lay on the coffee table beside Nora's stack of library books. It looked ordinary, almost disappointing, for something that could change the direction of her life. Emily connected it with a cable she had packed without thinking, then watched as old folders appeared one by one across the screen. Legacy Risk Review. Debt Exposure Model. Hospitality Revenue Forecasts. Shipping Contract Sensitivity. Board Routing Logs. Each file was a piece of a history the Whitmores had stolen without understanding its weight. She clicked through them carefully, not from nostalgia, but from discipline. The work was better than she remembered. Not perfect, not complete, but sharp. She had built it from scraps of information, late-night curiosity, and the stubborn instinct of a woman no one believed could read a balance sheet. The model had predicted stress points across Whitmore Group months before the executives admitted there was a problem. It had flagged risky hotel acquisitions in Florida, over-leveraged commercial real estate in Chicago, and shipping contracts that depended too heavily on fuel assumptions that were already shifting. It had been the difference between a private correction and a public collapse. And no one had said her name. At 6:15, Nora came into the living room in sweatpants, saw the spreadsheets reflected in Emily's eyes, and whispered, "You are either processing your divorce very strangely, or you are about to become terrifying." Emily did not look away from the screen. Both can be true. Nora sat beside her and listened as Emily explained just enough. Not the marriage, not the humiliation, not the slow erosion of being tolerated in a home where every smile had conditions. She explained the model. She explained the archived logs. She explained that the agreement she signed tried to restrict public discussion of Whitmore matters, but it did not transfer ownership of independent work created before formal employment, because Emily had never been an employee. She had been a wife. The Whitmores had treated that like a weakness. Legally, it might be the only reason her work still belonged to her. Nora, who had become a corporate attorney at a small but relentless firm downtown, read the first few pages of the divorce agreement with a stillness Emily recognized as professional anger. "They expected you to take the check," Nora said. "They expected you to be grateful." Emily closed one folder and opened another. "They expected me to disappear." Nora looked at the external drive. "Then disappear correctly." That became the first rule. Emily would not fight Alexander in public. She would not give Margaret the scandal she expected. She would not cry for cameras, leak private messages, or beg for recognition from people who had built entire lives on denying it. Instead, she would become legally clean, financially independent, and impossible to dismiss. Nora helped her find a temporary sublet in Long Island City, a small one-bedroom with a view of a brick wall and enough room for a desk. Emily sold the designer gowns Alexander's mother had approved and bought a used office chair, a second monitor, and blackout curtains. She changed her phone number. She closed every account connected to the Whitmore household. She stopped using the name Whitmore before the ink on the divorce agreement had dried. For 3 weeks, nothing happened publicly. That was exactly what Margaret wanted and exactly what Emily needed. In the society pages, Vanessa Blake began appearing more often at foundation events. Business columns described Alexander as focused on a new era of strategic growth. No one mentioned Emily. A few gossip blogs wondered where the Duke's quiet wife had gone, then moved on to a senator's daughter's engagement party. The world was very good at forgetting women who left rooms without making noise. Emily used that forgetting like cover. She spent 16 hours a day rebuilding the model from the ground up, not for Whitmore Group, but for every company like it. Proud, overextended, badly advised, rich in assets, poor in discipline. She fed the system public filings, local tax records, commercial occupancy data, shipping indexes, consumer travel patterns, regional employment shifts, loan maturity schedules, and court records. She learned which companies looked strong because their buildings were beautiful and which ones were strong because their cash flow could survive winter. She learned that distressed businesses often had the same problem as unhappy marriages. Everyone inside knew the truth before anyone outside could prove it. The first person to take her seriously was not a banker. It was a 72-year-old diner owner in New Jersey named Frank Bell, who had inherited a small chain of family restaurants and nearly lost all of them because a regional lender wanted to force a sale of his best location. Emily found him through a bankruptcy notice buried in a county database. She spent 2 days reviewing his leases, supplier costs, and foot traffic patterns. Then she called Nora and asked whether a newly formed advisory company could legally negotiate a restructuring fee instead of charging up front. Nora said yes, if Emily did it carefully. Emily called Frank and told him his company was not failing. His financing was. He hung up on her twice. On the third call, she told him exactly which lender clause would cost him his flagship property within 90 days. The line went quiet. "Who are you?" he asked. Emily looked around her bare apartment, at the folding table she used as a desk, at the subway light flashing across the ceiling. Someone who reads the parts other people skip. Frank became her first client. She saved 3 of his 5 locations, negotiated a refinancing package through a community bank, and took a small success fee that felt enormous because it was hers. More importantly, Frank told everyone he knew that a woman named Emily Carter had seen through numbers his accountant had missed. Her second client was a logistics company in Ohio with 17 trucks and a cash flow problem disguised as a fuel problem. Her third was a hotel group in Arizona whose owners had been one bad loan covenant away from losing property they had held for 30 years. Emily did not chase glamour. She chased weakness she could understand. Every client gave her more data. Every solved problem made the model smarter. Every invoice paid without the Whitmore name attached became a brick in the foundation of a life no one had handed her. By the 6th month, she had a company name, Carter Vale Analytics. Carter, for herself. Vale, because valleys looked low from a distance, but they were where rivers gathered force. Nora hated the explanation and loved the name. They rented a 2-room office above a dental clinic in Brooklyn, with heating that clanged in the mornings and an elevator that worked only when it felt generous. Emily hired her first analyst, Priya Raman, a former risk associate who had left a major bank after being told she was too direct with senior clients. Priya arrived with a green notebook, a sharp mind, and no patience for fragile egos. Emily hired her on the spot. 2 months later, she hired Marcus Lee, a former commercial real estate researcher from Seattle who could look at a city map and tell which neighborhoods were lying about growth. The office was small, the coffee was bad, and the work was relentless. It was also the first room Emily had ever entered where no one asked why she was there. Across the river, Alexander heard almost nothing. That was not because Emily hid poorly. It was because he did not look. In his version of the story, she had signed, left, and accepted the natural order of things. When Margaret told him Emily had not deposited the check because women from modest backgrounds often confused pride with strategy, Alexander believed it because belief was easier than curiosity. When Vanessa suggested Emily might someday attempt a public accusation, Margaret dismissed the idea. "She has no platform," Margaret said over brunch at the Whitmore townhouse, "and no one of consequence will attach themselves to her." Alexander accepted that, too. He had meetings to attend, investors to charm, and a family legacy to modernize. If Emily crossed his mind, it was usually at inconvenient moments. When he passed the library and saw the chair where she used to read late into the night, when a junior analyst mentioned a risk scenario in language that sounded strangely familiar, or when he found a mug she had left behind in the back of a kitchen cabinet. He told himself discomfort was not regret. It was adjustment. Men like Alexander had been trained to rename emotion until it became manageable. The first crack in his confidence appeared nearly 9 months after the divorce, during a private investment conference in Miami. Alexander was seated on a panel about legacy companies adapting to modern volatility. He gave his usual polished remarks about heritage, resilience, and disciplined leadership. Then a fund manager from Boston asked whether Whitmore Group was using any methodology similar to the Carter Vale distress model now gaining attention among mid-market lenders. Alexander turned his head slightly. "The what?" The moderator smiled. "Carter Vale Analytics. They have been quietly cleaning up distressed asset portfolios. Some people are calling their model unusually accurate." Vanessa, seated in the front row, checked her phone. Margaret, 2 seats beside her, went still for half a second before resuming her perfect expression. Alexander noticed. After the panel, He asked his chief financial officer to prepare a short briefing on Carter Vale. The briefing arrived 2 days later. It was thin, dismissive, and wrong. Small advisory firm. Female founder. Limited institutional exposure. Strong results with regional clients, but no major threat. The founder's name was listed as Emily C. Alexander read that line twice, then told himself Carter was a common name. He did not ask for more. Pride turned away before fear could introduce itself. Emily, meanwhile, was no longer working only with restaurants and truck routes. Her model had caught the attention of a retired private equity partner named Daniel Reeves, a man known for wearing cheap watches and making expensive decisions. Daniel requested a meeting after Carter Vale correctly predicted that a chain of boutique hotels would breach its loan covenants 2 quarters before the board disclosed it. Emily expected him to offer advice. Instead, he offered capital. Not charity. Not mentorship dressed as control. Capital, in exchange for a minority stake and a board seat with limited authority. Emily read every page of his proposal 3 times. Nora redlined it until Daniel's attorneys sounded personally offended. Priya built a risk case against accepting the money. Marcus built a growth case for accepting it. Emily listened to everyone, then negotiated harder than Daniel expected. "You were married to old money, were you not?" Daniel asked during the final meeting, amused but respectful. Emily did not blink. Briefly, "It taught you something." "Yes," she said. "Never admire wealth so much that you stop checking the debt beneath it." Daniel signed. With his backing, Carter Vale Analytics became Carter Vale Capital. The company moved into a real office in Lower Manhattan, 22 floors up, with conference rooms named after rivers instead of founders because Emily refused to build a shrine to herself. They began buying minority positions in distressed but salvageable companies, using data to identify when leadership was the problem and when timing was. Emily was not reckless. She did not want revenge badly enough to become careless. That made her more dangerous. She passed on deals that would have made headlines because the fundamentals were rotten. She took quiet positions in companies everyone else mocked and turned them around with operational discipline, better financing, and leadership changes that were clean rather than cruel. Within 2 years, Carter Vale had saved a medical supply distributor in Pennsylvania, rebuilt a hotel portfolio across the Southwest, and acquired a struggling software firm in Austin whose data tools became the backbone of Emily's internal systems. Financial reporters began describing Carter as elusive. Industry insiders began describing her as ruthless. Employees described her as exacting, fair, and impossible to impress with titles. Emily did not correct any of them. The less they understood her, the more room she had to move. Yet she never forgot Whitmore Group. She did not obsess over Alexander, but she watched the company the way a storm watcher reads pressure changes miles offshore. She saw the first signs before the market did. Whitmore was expanding too aggressively into luxury hospitality at a time when regional demand was shifting. Their shipping contracts were exposed to cost swings their executives had underestimated. Their commercial real estate holdings looked impressive on investor decks and vulnerable on debt schedules. Worse, Alexander had begun relying heavily on advice from Vanessa's family office, which favored image-heavy acquisitions and short-term investor excitement. Emily read the filings and saw vanity disguised as strategy. She knew the pattern because she had once lived inside it. Then came the acquisition that changed everything. Whitmore Group announced plans to purchase Halden Resorts, a chain of high-end coastal properties from Maine to South Carolina. The press called it bold. Vanessa called it visionary. Alexander called it the next chapter of Whitmore hospitality. Emily's model called it a timing failure with hidden renovation exposure, weak seasonal cash flow, and compliance costs that had been buried so deeply in the disclosures that only someone patient would find them. Carter Vale did not interfere. Emily held the report in her office late one evening, reading the projected downside while Manhattan glittered beyond the windows. Priya stood beside her, arms folded. "We could short related debt exposure through a partner fund," Priya said. Emily shook her head. "No, we could alert one of the lenders." "No." Marcus looked up from the conference table. "Then what do we do?" Emily closed the folder. "We let Alexander buy exactly what he thinks he deserves." That was the second rule. She would not push Whitmore Group off a cliff. She would let it walk toward the edge under its own leadership, documented at every step, witnessed by every lender, every board member, and every investor who had clapped while ignoring the warning signs. Revenge, Emily had learned, was strongest when it looked indistinguishable from consequence. A few weeks after the Halden deal closed, Emily received an invitation to a private finance dinner in Chicago. Alexander was listed as a speaker. Vanessa was listed as a guest of honor through her family office. Emily almost declined. Then she saw the discussion topic, the future of legacy capital. She accepted under the name Emily Carter, Chief Executive Officer of Carter Vale Capital. The dinner was held in a private club overlooking Lake Michigan, all dark wood, white tablecloths, and men who spoke in percentages as if numbers had no human weight. Alexander saw her before the first course. This time, there was no ballroom full of cameras to protect him and no mother standing between them. He froze near the entrance, one hand still holding a glass of sparkling water. For 3 seconds, he looked almost young, almost uncertain, almost like the man Emily had once hoped existed beneath the training. Then Vanessa touched his elbow and said something Emily could not hear. His expression reset. He crossed the room with Vanessa beside him. "Emily," he said, careful and formal. "I did not expect to see you here." Emily looked at him with the same calm he had once mistaken for weakness. "That makes 2 of us. I did not expect Whitmore Group to still be calling Halden Resorts a growth asset." Vanessa's smile tightened. Alexander's eyes sharpened. "You follow our acquisitions?" "I follow risk," Emily said. "Sometimes it wears a familiar name." A man nearby turned to listen. Alexander noticed and lowered his voice. "If this is about the past, this is not the place." Emily almost pitied him then. He still believed the most dangerous thing she carried was personal pain. "The past is not your problem, Alexander," she said. "Your balance sheet is." Vanessa gave a soft laugh. "That is a bold comment from a boutique fund." Emily turned to her. "Boutique is what people call you before your lenders start returning my calls." The silence that followed was brief, but it was enough. Alexander stared at Emily as if he were seeing her in focus for the first time and resenting the delay. The dinner moved on. Speeches were given. Toasts were made. But Alexander's attention kept drifting back to her table, where senior lenders, distressed asset managers, and 2 pension fund advisors leaned in when Emily spoke. She did not perform. She did not charm. She answered questions with clean precision, and the room adjusted around the weight of her competence. By the time dessert arrived, Alexander understood something he should have understood years earlier. Emily Carter had not vanished into sadness. She had vanished into preparation. Still, he did nothing. Not then. Not when Whitmore's debt costs rose. Not when Halden's renovation liabilities doubled. Not when 2 board members privately suggested slowing expansion. Alexander trusted the old machinery of reputation until the machinery began to grind. And far away from the townhouse where Margaret still believed Emily had been properly erased, Carter Vale Capital quietly began purchasing Whitmore's discounted debt through separate funds, one piece at a time, not enough to alarm the market, but enough to become meaningful when the right door opened. Emily did not rush. She had learned patience in rooms designed to make her feel small. Now patience had become her sharpest asset. By the end of the 3rd year, her company had grown from a borrowed couch and a stolen history into a firm powerful enough to move lenders with one phone call. Whitmore Group, meanwhile, had grown louder, shinier, and weaker. The gap between image and reality widened every quarter. Emily watched it all without smiling. She did not want Alexander ruined by rumor. She wanted him standing in full daylight, surrounded by his board, reading the numbers himself. She wanted him to understand that the empire he believed protected him had been protected once by the wife he discarded. And when the call finally came from a Whitmore lender asking whether Carter Vale Capital would consider leading a rescue acquisition, Emily was not surprised. She simply looked across her conference table at Nora, Priya, Marcus, and Daniel, then opened the file she had been building for 3 years. On the first page was a single sentence typed in clean black letters. "Whitmore Group is ready." The call from Whitmore's lender did not make Emily feel victorious. Victory was too simple a word for something that had taken 3 years of discipline, restraint, and silence. She sat in the glass conference room at Carter Vale Capital with the speakerphone glowing in the center of the table, listening as a senior credit officer from Marlowe Bank described Whitmore Group's situation in the careful language bankers used when they did not want to say panic. Liquidity pressure, covenant concerns, asset underperformance, leadership uncertainty. Emily heard the truth beneath each phrase. Whitmore was bleeding cash, the board was divided, and Alexander no longer had enough reputation left to borrow his way out of consequences. Across the table, Nora Sullivan had a legal pad open, already writing names. Priya Raman watched the lender's tone more than his words. Marcus Lee flipped through property maps, debt charts, and hotel occupancy projections. Daniel Reeves leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable, but Emily knew he was measuring the moment the way he measured every deal, not by emotion, but by leverage. We understand Carter Vale has experience stabilizing distressed legacy groups, the lender said. Would your firm consider taking a lead position in a recapitalization? Emily looked down at the first page of the file in front of her. Whitmore Group is ready. She had typed that sentence months earlier, not because she wished for collapse, but because collapse had become visible to anyone patient enough to read what Whitmore tried to hide. No, Emily said. The line went quiet. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. The lender cleared his throat. No, Carter Vale would not lead a recapitalization that leaves current governance intact, Emily replied. Whitmore Group does not have a capital problem. It has a decision-making problem. New money under old control would only delay the next crisis. Priya's mouth barely moved, but Emily caught the hint of approval. The lender hesitated. What structure would you consider? Emily turned one page. Control acquisition, debt purchase, board replacement, immediate review of Halden Resorts. Executive authority transferred on closing. No ceremonial rescue. No vanity financing. No public fiction that the current leadership saved itself. For the first time, the banker stopped sounding polite and started sounding alert. That would be a difficult proposal for Lord Whitmore to accept. Emily's eyes stayed on the file. Then he can reject it. After the call ended, the conference room remained silent for several seconds. Outside the glass walls, Carter Vale employees moved through the office with their usual focus, unaware that the company's next deal was not just large, not just dangerous, but personal in a way Emily had spent years refusing to let define her. Daniel was the first to speak. You know they will call this revenge. Emily closed the folder. They called my competence invisible. I survived that. Nora tapped her pen once against the legal pad. The divorce agreement has confidentiality provisions. If this becomes public, they may try to make it look like you used private marital information. I did not, Emily said. Everything in the acquisition file comes from public filings, lender disclosures, market data, third-party audits, and debt positions purchased legally through disclosed entities. Nora nodded. Good. Then we make the paper trail cleaner than their reputation. Marcus slid a chart toward the center of the table. Halden is worse than we thought. Renovation costs are running 32% over initial disclosure. Coastal insurance premiums are up across the portfolio. And seasonal occupancy is not covering debt service in 4 major properties. Priya added. And Vanessa Blake's family office earned advisory fees on the Halden transaction. The fee structure rewarded closing, not performance. Emily looked at the number highlighted in red. There it was. Not betrayal in the romantic sense. Something colder. Incentive. Vanessa had encouraged Alexander toward a deal that made her family richer whether Whitmore succeeded or not. Alexander had mistaken flattery for strategy, proximity for loyalty, elegance for expertise. Emily had once tried to warn him about that kind of blindness. He had not listened when she was his wife. Now he would hear it from the other side of a purchase agreement. Within 48 hours, Carter Vale sent a confidential term sheet to Marlowe Bank and 3 other major creditors. The offer was precise, aggressive, and impossible to ignore. Carter Vale would acquire a controlling interest in Whitmore Group through a combination of discounted debt conversion, emergency capital injection, and direct purchase of preferred shares from weakened family trusts. In exchange, Carter Vale would receive immediate authority to replace the board, suspend non-essential acquisitions, and conduct an independent review of executive decisions over the previous 5 years. The offer gave creditors a way to recover value. It gave shareholders a chance to avoid disaster. It gave Alexander only one thing: the opportunity to surrender control before the market took it from him. The first response came from a Whitmore attorney who did not know Emily was behind Carter Vale. His email called the proposal opportunistic, excessive, and inconsistent with the dignity of the Whitmore legacy. Nora read it aloud in Emily's office and smiled. Dignity is doing a lot of work in this sentence. Emily stood by the window, looking down at Lower Manhattan. Reply with the numbers. Nora did. By the next morning, the tone had changed. The creditors wanted a meeting. The family trusts wanted clarity. 2 independent board members wanted assurance that Carter Vale would not pursue personal liability unless misconduct appeared in the review. That phrase mattered. Unless misconduct appeared. Emily knew misconduct rarely arrived wearing its own name. It arrived as missing attachments, rushed approvals, related party fees, board minutes that summarized instead of explained, and advisors who called risk manageable because admitting otherwise would cost them a bonus. Carter Vale's analysts worked through the weekend, building a presentation that did not need drama because the facts were dramatic enough. Whitmore's hotel expansion had been funded with debt layered so tightly that one bad season could trigger cascading pressure. The shipping division had been used as collateral for hospitality deals it did not benefit from. Several older commercial properties had been overvalued in internal reports. And Halden Resorts, the acquisition Alexander had praised in interviews, was less a jewel than an anchor wrapped in expensive branding. On Sunday evening, Emily stayed after everyone left. The office was quiet except for the low hum of the climate system and the distant sound of traffic below. She opened an old scanned photograph on her laptop, one she had almost deleted years ago. It showed her and Alexander at a foundation luncheon in Boston during the first year of their marriage. She was standing beside him in a pale blue dress, smiling carefully. He was looking away from her, already focused on someone more important across the room. Emily studied her own face in the photograph, not with pity, but with recognition. That woman had not been foolish. She had been hopeful in a room that profited from making hope look naive. Emily closed the image and opened the acquisition deck. Hope had not saved her. Work had. Monday morning, Alexander learned the name of the bidder. He was in his office at Whitmore headquarters when his general counsel placed the Carter Vale term sheet in front of him. Margaret was seated near the fireplace, composed as always. Vanessa stood by the windows, scrolling through messages until the attorney said, "There is one more detail." Alexander looked up. What detail? The chief executive officer of Carter Vale Capital is Emily Carter. No one spoke. Margaret's hand tightened slightly on the arm of her chair. Vanessa's gaze snapped away from her phone. Alexander stared at the page, but the letters did not become less impossible. Emily Carter. Not Emily C. Not a common name. Not a boutique firm he could dismiss over breakfast. Emily Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Carter Vale Capital. For a moment, the office seemed to lose its air. Alexander remembered the Chicago dinner. The way she had set his balance sheet was the problem. He remembered the Miami panel, the fund manager mentioning Carter Vale's model. He remembered the library 3 years earlier, her torn check on his desk, her voice calm enough to sound almost gentle when she said one day he would need cash more than she did. At the time, he had thought it was pride. Now it looked like prophecy. Margaret recovered first. "This is personal," she said. "She cannot be allowed near this company." The general counsel adjusted his glasses. "With respect, Lady Whitmore, Carter Vale already controls a significant portion of distressed Whitmore debt through affiliated funds. Several creditors support a meeting. Refusing to engage may accelerate enforcement actions." Vanessa's voice was bright, but strained. "Surely there are other buyers." "None offering terms this complete," the attorney said. "And none moving this quickly." Alexander did not look at Vanessa. He was still reading Emily's proposal, each clause more surgical than the last. Board replacement. Review of related party transactions. Suspension of Halden expansion. Control transfer on closing. The document did not insult him. It did not mention the divorce. It did not contain one emotional word. That made it worse. Emily had not written like an abandoned wife. She had written like someone who had already won the argument and was now pricing the remains. "Set the meeting," Alexander said quietly. Margaret turned toward him. "Absolutely not." He finally looked at his mother. "Do you have $2 billion by Friday?" Margaret's face went still. Vanessa stepped forward. "Alexander, you do not have to sit across from her." He looked at Vanessa then, and for the first time, There was doubt in his eyes where trust had always been convenient. Apparently, I do. 2 days later, Carter Vale confirmed the final negotiation at Whitmore headquarters in Manhattan. Emily requested the top-floor boardroom, full board attendance, creditor counsel present, and complete access to Halden transaction records before closing. Alexander's team objected to each condition. Emily granted none. On the morning of the meeting, she dressed in a white tailored suit and fastened her mother's old gold locket beneath the collar where no one could see it. Nora handed her the final binder. Priya gave her the updated debt schedule. Marcus sent the last property map to her tablet. Daniel walked beside her to the elevator and said, "You can still assign someone else to lead the room." Emily pressed the button for the lobby. "No, because you want him to see you?" Emily watched the elevator numbers descend. "Because for 3 years, everyone spoke about me in rooms where I was not given a chair. Today, I am taking the chair." The elevator doors opened to the lobby, where the Carter Vale team waited in silence. No one wished her luck. Luck had nothing to do with it. Across town, Alexander stood in the same boardroom where, years before, he had believed power belonged to the person seated at the head of the table. He had not yet understood that power could enter through the door, carrying a binder, wearing calm-like armor, and looking exactly like the woman he once paid to leave. The boardroom looked exactly as Emily remembered, and nothing like it at all. The same walnut table stretched beneath the same cold lights, the same city view glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the same Whitmore portraits watched from the paneled wall with painted confidence, as though generations of inherited power could still intimidate a woman carrying the numbers they had ignored. But this time, Emily did not stand behind Alexander. She did not wait near the door. She did not search anyone's face for permission to belong. She entered with Nora on her right, Priya and Marcus behind her, Daniel Reeves walking last with the quiet patience of a man who had seen empires overprice themselves before falling into discount. Alexander stood when she came in. It was a reflex, almost too late to be courtesy. Margaret remained seated at the far end of the room, her posture perfect, her expression carved from ice. Vanessa sat beside her, dressed in pale gray, holding a tablet she was not reading. The board members looked from Emily to Alexander and back again, each of them realizing that the scandal they had hoped to avoid had already become a negotiation. Emily placed her binder on the table and took the seat directly opposite Alexander. Not beside a junior publicist. Not at table 7. Opposite him. The room settled into a silence so sharp that even the attorneys seemed careful with their pens. Alexander spoke first. "Emily." His voice was controlled, but not steady enough to hide the strain. "Miss Carter will be fine," Nora said before Emily could answer. Emily did not smile. She opened the binder. "We are here because Whitmore Group has 48 hours before Marlowe Bank initiates protective enforcement, 72 hours before 2 additional lenders reserve their rights, and less than 2 weeks before your next debt service deadline forces disclosures your shareholders are not prepared to read." A board member near the center shifted in his chair. "That assessment is aggressive." Priya slid a printed schedule across the table. "It is current as of 7:30 this morning. Your internal numbers are using last quarter's occupancy assumptions. They are wrong." Marcus placed a map beside it. "And your Halden properties in Savannah, Newport, and Myrtle Beach are underperforming even the revised projections." Alexander looked at Emily, not at the documents. "You came prepared." "I usually do." The words were simple, but they carried 3 years of history without needing to name it. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Let us stop pretending this is purely business. You have no right to use a private grievance to threaten this family." Emily turned one page in her binder. "Carter Vale is not threatening your family. Your lenders are. Your debt is. Your acquisition record is. Your related party advisory fees are. I am offering a path that preserves value before your pride destroys what remains." Vanessa's eyes narrowed at the phrase related party advisory fees. "That is an ugly implication." Emily looked at her for the first time. "It is not an implication." Nora distributed a separate packet, thinner than the acquisition binder, but far more dangerous. Alexander opened it and saw advisory agreements connected to Halden Resorts, fee schedules routed through Blake family office affiliates, and approval memos signed under compressed timelines. Nothing in the packet screamed wrongdoing. That was the elegance of it. Each page looked respectable alone. Together, They told a story of incentives carefully placed where judgment should have been. A creditor attorney cleared his throat. For the record, Carter Vale is requesting full review authority over these transactions as part of closing. Margaret's voice dropped. This is outrageous. Daniel finally spoke. No, Lady Whitmore. Outrageous is asking creditors to trust the same governance that created the whole. Alexander flipped through the packet slowly. Emily watched his face change as the pattern revealed itself. Not all at once. Alexander was too proud for sudden collapse. First came irritation, then focus, then the small stillness of a man recognizing that a door behind him had been locked for months while he admired the hallway. He looked at Vanessa. Did your office receive success fees from Halden? Vanessa lifted her chin. Standard advisory compensation. Did you disclose the full structure to the board? Your counsel reviewed the materials. Nora said. Counsel reviewed summary materials. The underlying affiliate payments were not included in the board deck. A senior board member removed his glasses. Is that true? Vanessa did not answer quickly enough. The silence did more damage than denial. Emily let it sit. She had learned long ago that powerful rooms hated silence, because silence forced everyone to hear what was missing. Alexander closed the packet, his fingertips resting on the cover. What exactly do you want? Emily slid the acquisition proposal across the table. Control. The word landed with more force than anger could have. Carter Vale will acquire controlling interest, convert distressed debt, replace 5 board seats, suspend the Halden expansion pending review, and install an interim operating committee. You may remain as a transitional advisor for 90 days, without voting authority. Margaret stood. You expect a Whitmore to become a visitor in his own company? Emily looked up at her. No. I expect a Whitmore to experience accountability inside a company other people have been saving for years. Alexander's gaze sharpened. What does that mean? For the first time since entering the room, Emily paused. She had planned the sequence carefully. Numbers first, governance second, Vanessa third. Only then the truth he should have known before any of this began. Nora glanced at her, silently asking whether she was ready. Emily turned to the final tab in the binder and removed a single printed audit trail from 3 years earlier. The page was clean, technical, almost boring to anyone who did not understand its meaning. To Alexander, it would become the first crack in the story his family had told him about himself. Emily placed it in front of him. Before you decide whether I know this company well enough to buy it, she said, you should understand something your board has spent years pretending not to know. Alexander looked down. His eyes moved over the date, the internal routing code, the crisis file name, and the anonymous upload tied to the model that had saved Whitmore Group from a private collapse years before. Then he saw the authorship metadata recovered from the archive drive. Emily Carter. The room seemed to recede around him. He looked up slowly, and for the first time since she had walked through the door, he did not look like a duke, a chairman, or a man born to be obeyed. He looked like someone who had just discovered that the foundation beneath his legacy had carried her name all along. Alexander read the page once, then again, as if repetition could change the name printed at the bottom. Emily Carter. Not an assistant, not an anonymous consultant, not some forgotten analyst whose work had passed through Whitmore Group by accident. Emily Carter, the woman he had let sit alone at table 7, the woman his mother had handed divorce papers beside a salad plate, the woman he had paid to leave without ever asking what she knew. The boardroom did not move. Even the city beyond the windows seemed to hold its breath. A senior director leaned toward the audit trail, his face tightening as recognition settled in. This is from the liquidity review, he said quietly. The year before the Boston refinancing. Another board member looked at Alexander. We were told that model came from executive strategy. Emily folded her hands on the table. You were told many things. Margaret's chair scraped softly against the floor as she sat back down. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes had changed. For the first time, she looked less offended than exposed. That document was internal property, she said. Nora answered before Emily could. The archived file shows the model was uploaded from an external source before it entered Whitmore's internal system. The underlying work was created independently. Your company used it, routed it through senior leadership, and presented it as executive strategy. That is not ownership. That is appropriation. Alexander did not look at his mother. He kept staring at the audit trail, following the routing codes, the timestamps, the approval markers. He remembered that year now with painful clarity. The tense calls behind closed doors. The sudden shift in lender confidence. The board praising his instincts after a refinancing plan he had only half understood was placed in front of him already solved. He had accepted the praise because it was easy, because everyone expected him to, because men born into legacy were rarely asked to prove which ideas were truly theirs. "You knew?" he asked, his voice low. Emily held his gaze. "I built it." "No," he said, almost under his breath, not denying her, but rejecting the size of what it meant. "You never said anything." "I tried." His eyes lifted. "When? In this building? In your library? In your car? At dinner in Boston? In the hallway outside a board reception in Washington? Every time I asked why Whitmore was taking on exposure it did not understand, you told me not to worry about matters above my level." A creditor attorney glanced down at his notes, wisely choosing silence. Priya watched Alexander with cool precision, while Marcus kept his attention on the board, tracking which members looked surprised and which looked guilty. Emily had built the moment carefully, but even she felt the weight of it pressing against the room. This was not a confession made for sympathy. It was a record being corrected. Alexander turned to Margaret at last. "Did you know?" Margaret lifted her chin. "I knew she spent too much time involving herself in matters that did not concern her." "Did you know the model was hers?" Margaret's silence was elegant, practiced, and useless. Alexander's face changed again, not dramatically, not with the kind of regret that begged to be witnessed, but with something smaller and worse, understanding. He looked back at Emily. "Why did you not fight this when it happened?" Emily almost smiled. "With what power?" The question landed harder than accusation. She continued, her voice steady. "You controlled the house. Your mother controlled access. Your board controlled the records. Your attorneys controlled the language. I was the wife everyone described as fortunate. If I had spoken, they would have called me emotional, confused, ungrateful, or ambitious in the wrong way. So I waited until no one could afford to misunderstand me." Vanessa shifted in her seat. "This is a touching story, but it does not change the current offer." Emily turned toward her. "You are right. The offer is based on current facts. The story explains why I know where to look." Nora opened the thinner packet again and slid one page toward the middle of the table. For example, the Halden advisory structure. Vanessa's expression hardened. "My family office acted within standard market practice." Standard practice does not explain why your affiliate received a secondary consulting fee from a renovation contractor after the deal closed, Nora said. "That contractor is now 32% over budget across 3 properties." The boardroom stirred. A director at the far end leaned forward. "I have not seen that." Marcus placed another document beside it. "Because it was not included in the board materials. It appears in a subcontract disclosure filed at county level in South Carolina, then cross-referenced through insurance adjustment records." Vanessa looked at Alexander. "This is absurd. They are twisting paperwork." Priya spoke without raising her voice. "No, we are connecting paperwork. There is a difference." Alexander's jaw tightened. For years, Vanessa had been polished certainty beside him. She knew what to say in donor rooms, how to calm investors, how to make aggressive plans sound inevitable. But now, stripped of lighting and compliments, her confidence looked more like a performance built on other people not checking details. "Did you know about the secondary fee?" he asked. Vanessa's pause was brief, but in a room full of lenders, lawyers, and directors, brief was enough. "Alexander, my office handles many structures. I cannot personally track every vendor relationship." Emily said, "But you personally recommended the acquisition." Vanessa looked at her with a flash of contempt. "And you personally waited for it to fail." Emily did not deny it. "I waited for Alexander to trust the people he chose." The words turned the room back toward him. That was the cruelty of accountability. It did not let a man hide behind the people who misled him when he had enjoyed being misled. Alexander stood and walked toward the windows, his back to the table. 40 stories below, traffic moved in narrow streams between towers built by people who understood that height was not the same as stability. He had entered this meeting ready to endure embarrassment, negotiate terms, perhaps accuse Emily of resentment if she pushed too hard. He had not expected to discover that his company had once survived because of her mind. His current crisis had worsened because of his pride, and the woman he had dismissed had become the only person in the room with a workable plan. "What happens to the company if we refuse?" he asked without turning around. Daniel answered, "Creditors act independently. The stock takes another hit. Emergency financing becomes more expensive, if available at all. Halden becomes a public symbol of failed judgment. You lose control anyway, only with less value left." Alexander turned back. "And if we accept?" Emily opened the main binder to the restructuring summary. Carter Vale injects $500 million in immediate stabilization capital, converts distressed debt at agreed terms, replaces 5 board seats with independent operators, pauses Halden expansion, reviews related party transactions, and protects core employees from unnecessary cuts during the first 120 days. Shipping and commercial real estate remain operational. Hospitality is triaged property by property. The foundation is separated from corporate optics and audited independently. A director who had not spoken before looked up. "And Lord Whitmore." The old title hung in the room like a relic from another century. Emily looked at Alexander, then back to the director. 90 days as transitional advisor. No voting authority. No unilateral signing power. No press statement without joint approval. Margaret's voice was quiet, but sharp. "You intend to humiliate him." Emily turned to her. "No. I intend to prevent him from doing more damage while calling it leadership." Margaret's composure cracked just enough for everyone to see the anger beneath it. "You would not even understand this world if we had not let you into it." Emily's eyes did not move from Margaret's face. "You never let me into it. You locked me outside every room, and I learned the floor plan anyway." The silence after that belonged to Emily, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it with every fact on the table. Alexander returned to his chair slowly. He looked older than he had at the start of the meeting, not in years, but in certainty. The part of him that had always believed the Whitmore name could bend reality had finally met a reality that did not care about the name. "I need time," he said. Nora closed one folder. "You have until 5 o'clock tomorrow evening before Carter Vale's offer adjusts downward to reflect enforcement risk." Margaret stood again. "This is coercion." Daniel's tone remained calm. "This is market pressure. Your family used to be very fond of it when it worked in your favor." One of the independent board members, a former airline executive named Judith Crane, looked directly at Emily. "If Carter Vale takes control, what guarantees do we have that this will not become a personal purge?" Emily respected the question because it was the first serious one in the room. "You have my record. Every company Carter Vale has acquired retained essential employees, reduced executive waste first, and rebuilt lender trust before seeking expansion. I do not punish staff for leadership failure. I do not burn assets to make a point, and I do not need revenge badly enough to overpay for it." Judith held her gaze, then gave a slight nod. That nod shifted the air. The board was no longer united behind Alexander. The creditors had already moved. The numbers were already speaking. Emily did not have to win the room emotionally. She only had to make refusal look irresponsible. Vanessa sensed it too. She gathered her tablet and stood. "I will not sit here while my integrity is questioned by a woman who clearly built her career around a grudge." Emily looked at her calmly. "Your integrity is not being questioned because of me. It is being questioned because of the invoices." A few eyes dropped to the packet again. Vanessa had no clean answer, so she chose exit over exposure. "Alexander," she said, waiting for him to defend her. Once he would have stood automatically, offered a controlled statement, protected the woman whose confidence made him feel powerful. This time, he did not move. Vanessa's face tightened, and for the first time, Emily saw something close to fear beneath the polish. Not fear of Emily, fear of no longer being believed. Vanessa left the boardroom with 2 attorneys whispering behind her. The door closed softly, but its meaning was loud. Alexander stared at the closed door, then at the Halden packet, then at the audit trail bearing Emily's name. "I should have known," he said. Emily did not soften. "Yes." He looked at her, and the single word seemed to hurt more than a speech. "I should have asked. Yes. I should have protected you." Emily paused. That one reached a place she had spent years sealing shut. Not because she still wanted his protection, but because there had been a time when those words would have changed everything. She let the feeling pass through her without becoming visible. "You should have respected me," she said. Alexander lowered his eyes. There was no dramatic apology, no sudden redemption, no easy bridge back across what he had allowed to happen. The room was too full of documents for fantasy, too full of witnesses for denial, too full of consequence for romance. Emily gathered the audit trail and returned it to her binder. The offer stands until tomorrow at 5 o'clock. After that, Carter Vale protects its position like any other creditor. She rose. Her team rose with her. For one strange second, Alexander looked as if he might reach across the table, not to stop the deal, but to stop the ending that had already happened years ago and had only now become visible to him. He did not. Emily walked toward the door. Margaret's voice followed her, lower now, stripped of its old certainty. You think buying this company makes you one of us? Emily stopped, turned back, and looked at the woman who had mistaken cruelty for breeding and silence for victory. No, Emily said. That is why I am qualified to save it. Then she left the boardroom with the same calm she had carried into it, while behind her, Alexander Whitmore sat surrounded by the remains of every assumption that had ever protected him. By the time Emily returned to Carter Vale, the news had not reached the press, but it had already begun moving through the private channels where real power traveled first. Creditor Counsel had requested revised closing schedules. 2 Whitmore board members had asked Nora for conflict review procedures. Marlowe Bank wanted assurance that Carter Vale's capital injection could be wired within 24 hours of approval. No one had announced that Alexander Whitmore was losing control, but everyone important had started behaving as if he already had. Emily stood in her office with the boardroom binder open on her desk, watching the evening settle over Lower Manhattan. Her reflection in the glass looked composed, almost distant, but beneath that calm was a pressure she had not expected. Not doubt, not pity, memory. She remembered the first night in Nora's Queen's apartment, the borrowed couch, the elevated train, the laptop balanced on her knees while her old life burned quietly behind her. She remembered selling the dresses Margaret had chosen for her and using the money to buy a monitor. She remembered Frank Bell asking who she was, Priya walking into the Brooklyn office with a green notebook, Marcus arguing that a city map could expose a lie, Daniel signing the investment papers after she refused to give him control. None of them had seen a discarded wife. They had seen a builder. That was why the next decision mattered. Emily could not let this become the story Margaret wanted it to be, a bitter woman returning to punish a family that had rejected her. She would not hand them a smaller version of her victory. At 7:15, Nora entered without knocking, carrying a legal folder and 2 paper cups of coffee. The independent directors are leaning toward acceptance, she said. Judith Crane is pushing for it. She thinks the creditors will move if Alexander stalls. Emily accepted the coffee but did not drink it. And Margaret? Calling every old family contact she still believes can influence a bank. Nora set the folder down. It is not working. Vanessa? Her attorneys requested copies of the fee exhibits. They also asked whether Carter Vale intends to make a regulatory referral. Emily looked at the folder. Do we? Nora studied her carefully. If the review confirms undisclosed affiliate payments, we have an obligation to report through the proper channels. We do not have to dramatize it. Emily nodded. Then we do it properly. Nora waited a beat. Alexander called. Emily's hand stilled on the coffee cup. When, 10 minutes ago, I told him all communications go through counsel. Good. He said it was personal. Emily looked toward the city again. That is what people say when they dislike losing the formal channel. Nora's expression softened, but only slightly. Are you all right? Emily almost gave the efficient answer. Yes. Fine. Ready. But Nora had been there when fine was a couch, a coffee mug, and a woman trying not to shake while opening an external drive. So Emily told the truth in the only form she could afford. I am not unhappy. Nora nodded as if that made perfect sense. That may be enough for tonight. Across town, Alexander remained in the Whitmore boardroom long after most of the directors had left. The city outside had gone dark, and the table was covered with documents that seemed to accuse him without raising their voices. The Halden fee packet, the lender schedules, the acquisition terms, the audit trail with Emily's name. Margaret stood near the portrait wall, speaking sharply into her phone, but her old certainty no longer filled the room. Every call ended faster than the one before it. Every name she invoked produced sympathy instead of money. Vanessa had not returned. That absence told Alexander more than her defense would have. He had sent 2 messages asking for a full explanation of the Halden advisory structure. She had replied with one sentence, "My counsel will respond." Counsel, not Vanessa, not the woman who had stood beside him at galas, praised his instincts, and told him that bold men deserved bold moves. Counsel. Alexander sat at the head of the table and read Emily's proposal again. It was merciless, but it was not reckless. That disturbed him most. If she had overreached, he could have called it emotion. If she had insulted him, he could have called it revenge. But the document was clean. It preserved operating divisions, protected employees, stabilized lenders, removed weak governance, paused bad expansion. It did everything he should have done before pride made delay expensive. At 9:30, Margaret ended another failed call and turned toward him. "You cannot sign this." Alexander did not look up. "We may not have a choice." "There is always a choice." "No," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "There is always a story people tell when the choices are gone." Margaret's mouth tightened. "You are tired. Do not let that woman humiliate you into surrender." That woman. Even now, Margaret could not say Emily's name without reducing it. Something in Alexander's chest twisted, not romantically, not cleanly, but with the ugly recognition of how many times he had allowed those reductions to stand because correcting them would have been inconvenient. "Did you erase her from the liquidity review?" he asked. Margaret's face went still. "I protected the company from confusion." "Did you erase her? She was your wife, not an executive. She saved us." Margaret stepped closer. She meddled. "We refined. We acted. That is how institutions survive. They absorb useful things." Alexander stared at his mother, and for the first time, the language of his childhood sounded less like wisdom and more like theft with polished manners. "And people," he asked, "do institutions absorb them too?" Margaret looked away first. That was the answer. By morning, the independent directors had made their position clear. Without Carter Vale, Whitmore Group would face lender action, public downgrade, and a forced asset sale that could dismantle the company in pieces. With Carter Vale, the Whitmore family would lose control, but the business could survive. The vote was scheduled for 4 o'clock, 1 hour before Emily's deadline. Alexander arrived alone. Margaret came separately with counsel. Vanessa did not appear, sending attorneys in her place. Judith Crane opened the meeting with a sentence that made the outcome inevitable. "Our duty is to the company, not to the comfort of the family that founded it." The vote passed by a margin large enough to be humiliating and narrow enough to reveal who still feared Margaret. Alexander voted in favor. When his counsel asked whether he understood that the decision transferred operational control to Carter Vale upon closing, he said yes. The words sounded small in the room that had once made him feel untouchable. At Carter Vale, Emily received the signed acceptance at 4:42. Nora placed it on her desk. Priya released a breath she had been holding for days. Marcus whispered, "It is done," then immediately corrected himself. "No, it starts." Daniel looked at Emily. "Congratulations." Emily read the signature page. Alexander's name sat beneath the approval language, precise and dark. For 3 years, she had imagined many versions of this moment. In none of them had it felt like celebration. It felt like standing at the end of a long bridge and realizing she did not need to cross back to prove she had survived. "Prepare closing," she said, "and notify the employee transition team. I want staff communications ready before the market hears anything." Daniel smiled faintly, still thinking about employees before victory. Emily closed the folder. "That is the victory." The next morning, Carter Vale and Whitmore Group issued a joint statement announcing a control acquisition and stabilization plan. The financial press reacted within minutes. Some called it a stunning reversal. Some called it the fall of a legacy dynasty. A few tried to frame it as personal drama when they discovered Emily's prior marriage to Alexander, but Nora had prepared for that. The official documents left little room for gossip to outrun governance. The story that mattered was not that a former wife had returned. It was that a better operator had arrived. By noon, Emily walked back into Whitmore headquarters, not as a guest, not as a spouse, not as a woman seated at the wrong table, but as the new controlling executive authority. Employees lined the lobby with the cautious curiosity of people who had survived too many executive promises. Emily stopped before the security gates and addressed them without a podium. I know many of you are afraid this morning, she said. You did not create the decisions that brought this company here. My first priority is stability, honesty, and work that protects the business instead of protecting egos. Titles will be reviewed. Jobs will be respected. Numbers will tell the truth. No applause came at first. Then a woman from accounting began to clap, quietly. Then others followed, not loudly, but with relief. From the mezzanine above, Alexander watched. Emily did not look up. She did not need to. He had once believed power was being seen beside the right people. Now he watched the woman he had failed to see become the person everyone in his building was looking toward. By the end of the first week, the building had changed without changing its walls. The Whitmore crest still hung above the lobby. The elevators still opened onto polished floors, and the portraits still watched from their expensive frames. But the old fear had begun to drain out of the hallways. Emily removed 3 executives whose titles had been larger than their results. She froze the Halden expansion, ordered a full review of the Blake family office advisory fees, and separated the foundation from corporate publicity so donations could no longer be used as decoration for bad judgment. She did not raise her voice. She did not celebrate anyone's fall. That made every decision feel final. Alexander remained for the 90-day transition, but his office was moved from the corner suite to a smaller advisory room 2 floors below. No one announced it as punishment. No one needed to. Each morning, he watched employees enter Emily's meetings with nervous shoulders and leave with assignments they understood. He watched lenders who once flattered his family now answer her calls on the first ring. He watched the company become steadier under the woman he had once believed needed his name to matter. On the final day of the transition, Alexander found Emily in the library archives at Whitmore headquarters, reviewing the old files that had carried her work without her credit. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "I thought losing the company would be the worst part." Emily closed the folder. It was not. He looked at the audit trail in her hand. "No, the worst part is realizing I lost the truth years before I lost control." She studied him carefully. He looked tired, but not performative. There was no Vanessa beside him, no Margaret speaking through him, no board waiting to approve his pride. Just Alexander, finally standing in a room without protection. "I am sorry," he said. "For the gala. For the papers. For never asking who you were before deciding what you were worth." Emily let the apology exist between them. Once, it would have been everything. Now it was only a sentence arriving late to a life that had already moved on. "I hope you mean that," she said. "But I did not come back for your regret." Alexander nodded, as if the answer hurt because it was fair. "And if I asked for a chance to know you now?" Emily looked toward the window, where Manhattan spread beneath the afternoon light, loud, crowded, and unfinished. "You had a wife who wanted to be seen," she said. "Now you have a chief executive officer you need to respect." She walked past him and left the archive with the folder in her hand. That evening, Carter Vale announced the new company name, Carter Whitmore Global. Reporters called it poetic. Margaret called it insulting. Alexander said nothing, because he understood before anyone else did. Emily had not kept the Whitmore name because she still belonged to him. She kept it because she had taken the part of his legacy worth saving and placed it under leadership that would never again confuse silence with weakness. But just before midnight, as Emily prepared to leave the office, Nora appeared at her door holding a sealed envelope from an old estate attorney in Boston. The letter inside had been written by Alexander's late father years before the marriage. At the top was a line that made Emily stop breathing for one clean second. "To the first wife of Alexander Whitmore, when she is finally ready to learn why this marriage was arranged."